The December wind cut through the bare branches outside David Anderson's window as he sat at the oak desk that had belonged to his grandmother, the same desk where he'd written every important letter of his life. The cursor blinked mockingly on the blank computer screen, but his hands reached instead for the fountain pen Margaret had given him on their 5th anniversary, the one with the silver nib that caught the light just so when he wrote her name. 3 years, 3 Christmases since the cancer had taken her, and still he found himself here every December 24th, writing letters to a woman who would never read them. The ritual had begun the first Christmas after her death, born from a desperation so profound it felt like drowning. He'd written about the grocery store cashier who'd asked where Margaret was, about the way her coffee mug still sat in the cabinet because he couldn't bear to use it or put it away, about the sound of her laughter that he was beginning to forget, despite playing the voicemails on her old phone until the battery died. The letters had evolved over the years. That first Christmas, he'd written 23 pages of raw grief, his handwriting deteriorating as the whiskey took hold and the words became illegible through tears. The second year brought shorter letters, more controlled, filled with updates about their mutual friends, about the changes in their Minneapolis neighborhood, about the way the snow fell differently somehow, as if even the weather mourned her absence. Now, in year 3, the letters had become something else entirely. They were conversations he needed to have, confessions of the guilt that ate at him daily, admissions of the small moments of happiness that felt like betrayals of her memory. He wrote about waking up on a Tuesday morning and forgetting for exactly 14 seconds that she was gone. He wrote about the woman at the farmer's market who'd smiled at him and how he'd felt something crack inside his chest, something that might have been possibility if it hadn't been immediately swallowed by shame. David uncapped the pen and began to write, his handwriting steady despite the tremor that had developed in his left hand since the accident. The words came slowly tonight, each sentence a careful excavation of emotions he'd buried deep enough to function through the other 11 months of the year. My dearest Margaret, I drove past the house on Elm Street today, the one with the blue shutters you always said you wanted to paint purple. Someone new moved in last week. A woman, I think, though I haven't seen her clearly, just glimpses through windows, the soft glow of lights that suggests someone is trying to make a home there. It made me think of you, of how you could walk into any space and make it feel alive within hours. You had that gift, didn't you? The ability to see potential where others saw only emptiness. He paused, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into Christmas Eve. Somewhere down the block, the Hendersons were having their annual party, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifting through the winter air like music from another life. He'd been invited, of course. Joan Henderson had made a point of stopping by last week with an invitation and a casserole, her eyes holding that careful mixture of concern and determination that he'd come to recognize in the faces of people who cared about him, but didn't quite know what to do with his grief. I keep thinking about what you said in the hospital during one of your lucid moments between the morphine doses. You told me that grief wasn't meant to be a permanent address, that it was supposed to be a place you visited, felt fully, and then left behind. You said you wanted me to promise that I'd learn to live again, not just exist. I nodded and held your hand and promised, because that's what you needed to hear. But I don't think either of us truly understood what that would mean. The pen scratched against the paper. The only sound in the house, besides the ancient radiator's intermittent groaning. David had kept the thermostat exactly where Margaret had always preferred it, 68 degrees, even though he ran cold now and often found himself wearing sweaters indoors. Change, even the smallest adjustments, felt like erasure. Living feels like betrayal sometimes. Last month, I laughed at something on the radio, really laughed, the kind that starts in your belly and escapes before you can stop it. For about 3 seconds, I forgot that laughing without you meant laughing alone. Then the guilt hit like a physical thing, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed. How do I honor your memory while still allowing myself moments of lightness? How do I carry you with me without carrying you like a burden? Outside, snow began to fall, the flakes catching the streetlight and dancing in the amber glow. Margaret had loved the first snow of the season, would press her face to the window like a child and make him promise they'd go for a walk before it melted. He'd grumbled about the cold, but always bundled up and joined her, watching as she caught snowflakes on her tongue and spun in circles until she was dizzy with joy. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, so quiet he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. David glanced at the clock. 9:15 on Christmas Eve, too late for carolers, too early for Christmas Day visitors. He set the pen down carefully and made his way to the front door, his socked feet silent on the hardwood floors that Margaret had insisted on refinishing the year before her diagnosis. Through the peephole, he saw a woman he didn't recognize, though something about her seemed familiar. She was perhaps 40, with auburn hair escaping from a wool hat and a face that suggested she'd been crying recently. In her hands, she held an envelope. David opened the door slowly, the cold air rushing in and raising goosebumps on his arms. The woman looked up at him with eyes the color of sea glass, and he noticed she was shivering despite her heavy coat. "I'm so sorry to bother you so late," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that might have been from cold or emotion. "I'm Lily Roberts. I just moved into the house on Elm Street. I found this in the basement, tucked behind the water heater. It's addressed to you." She held out the envelope, and David saw his name written in handwriting that made his knees nearly buckle. Margaret's careful script, the way she dotted her I's with tiny circles instead of dots, the slight leftward slant that came from being left-handed in a right-handed world. His hands shook as he took the envelope, noting its weight, the way the paper felt expensive and deliberate. Margaret had always been particular about stationery, believed that important words deserved beautiful paper. "Did you know the previous owner?" Lily asked gently, and David realized he'd been staring at the envelope for several long moments without speaking. "She was my wife," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She died 3 years ago. I don't understand how." "She never lived in that house." Lily's expression shifted to something deeper than sympathy, something that recognized the weight of what she'd just handed him. "Would you like to sit down?" she asked. "Maybe we could figure this out together." Something in her tone, a quality of genuine concern without pity, made David step aside and gesture her in. She stomped her boots on the mat and unwrapped the scarf from around her neck, revealing a face that was pretty in an understated way, with laugh lines around her eyes and a mouth that looked like it smiled often, though it was serious now. She followed him into the living room, where the Christmas tree Margaret had insisted on buying the November before she died still stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments they'd collected over 15 years of marriage. David had never had the heart to take it down, had simply unplugged the lights and let it stand sentinel over his grief. It was artificial, would last forever if he let it, a monument to the last Christmas they'd shared. Lily settled onto the edge of the couch, her coat still buttoned, as if she wasn't sure she'd be staying long. David sat in his chair, the envelope heavy in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years found himself in the presence of someone who wasn't trying to fix his grief or rush him through it. "The house on Elm Street," she began, settling back slightly as she spoke, "belonged to a woman named Eleanor Vance. I bought it from her estate after she passed last year. She was in her 80s, never married, but the neighbors said she was like a mother to half the street. When I was cleaning out the basement, I found a whole box of letters and documents she'd been keeping for people. Wills, birth certificates, love letters that people had asked her to hold on to for safekeeping." David's thumb traced the edge of the envelope, feeling the familiar texture of the paper Margaret had favored for special occasions. How did Margaret know Eleanor? He wondered aloud. We lived 6 blocks away. I don't remember her ever mentioning anyone on Elm Street. Sometimes connections exist in ways we don't see, Lily said softly. Eleanor had a reputation for helping people, especially women going through difficult times. Maybe your wife went to her for something and asked her to hold on to this. The possibility settled over David like a weight. Margaret had become increasingly private during her illness, disappearing for hours at a time on what she claimed were errands or doctor's appointments. He'd assumed she needed space to process her diagnosis, never pushed for details when she returned home quieter than when she'd left. David turned the envelope over, noting that it was sealed, but that the glue had weakened with age and humidity. Margaret's handwriting on the front was careful, formal, as if she'd taken great care with each letter. David Anderson was written in the center, but below it, in smaller script, were words that made his breath catch. To be delivered Christmas 2023. 3 years, he whispered. She knew exactly when she wanted me to receive this. Lily leaned forward slightly, her expression gentle but curious. The date tells a story, doesn't it? She planned for this moment. David's hands were shaking as he carefully opened the envelope, trying not to damage the paper that Margaret had touched, that carried her DNA and her intentions and her love forward through time. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, and a smaller sealed envelope that felt heavier than paper alone. He unfolded the letter, and Margaret's voice seemed to fill the room as he read her words silently, his lips moving slightly as if he were speaking to her across the years. My darling David, if you're reading this, it means 3 years have passed since I left you, and I hope with all my heart that you've begun to heal. I'm writing this on September 15th, 2 weeks after Dr. Martinez told us the treatment wasn't working, and I've spent every day since then thinking about how to help you find your way back to life after I'm gone. I know you, my love. I know you'll write to me every Christmas Eve because that's who you are. Faithful, devoted, unable to let go even when letting go would be kinder to yourself. I know you'll keep our house exactly as we left it. We'll sleep on your side of the bed and leave my coffee mug in the cabinet, and probably let that artificial Christmas tree stand in the corner until it falls apart from neglect. David's eyes filled with tears, and he had to pause in his reading. Margaret had known him so completely, had seen forward into his grief with the clarity that comes from deep love. I'm sorry, Lily said quietly. I should go and let you read this privately. No, David said quickly, surprising himself. Please stay. I don't think I can do this alone. Lily settled back into the couch, her presence warm and undemanding, and David continued reading. I've been visiting Eleanor Vance for the past month. She's a remarkable woman who understands the weight of love and loss better than most. I've asked her to hold this letter and to arrange for it to be delivered to you exactly 3 years after my death, on Christmas Eve. I chose that date because it's when your grief will be deepest, when you'll be writing to me again, convinced that you're talking to someone who can't hear you. But I can hear you, David, not in the way I heard you when I was alive. But love doesn't end with death. It changes form, finds new ways to reach across the distance between what was and what is. Every letter you've written, every word you've spoken to my memory, I've felt in whatever way love persists beyond the boundaries of the physical world. Now I need you to listen carefully, because what I'm going to tell you might be the most important thing I've ever said to you. Your grief is not a monument to my life. Your happiness is not a betrayal of my memory. I loved you not so you could spend the rest of your life mourning me, but so you could carry that love forward and find new ways to share it with the world. David set the letter down for a moment, overwhelmed by the sensation that Margaret was speaking directly to him across 3 years of silence. Lily handed him a tissue from her purse without comment, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary person," Lily said softly. "She was," David replied. "She always saw possibilities where other people saw problems. Even dying. She was still trying to take care of me." He picked up the letter again, his hands steadier now, anchored by Margaret's words and by Lily's quiet presence. "I've watched you these past months since my diagnosis, and I've seen how you've begun to disappear into your devotion to me. It's beautiful and heartbreaking and completely unsustainable. After I'm gone, you'll disappear even further into the safety of grief, because grief is easier than risk, easier than the vulnerability required to love again. But here's what I need you to understand. I don't want to be the last woman you love. I want to be the first woman who loved you so completely that you learned what real love feels like, what it means to be truly known and accepted. I want you to take that knowledge and find someone else to share it with. This isn't about replacing me. No one will ever be me, just as no one will ever be you. This is about honoring what we had by refusing to let it become a prison. The greatest tribute you could give to our marriage is to love again, differently but just as deeply." David's breath caught in his throat. These were words he'd never expected to hear, permission he'd never thought to ask for. Margaret had anticipated not just his grief, but his guilt, had reached across death to absolve him of sins he hadn't even committed yet. "The woman who delivered this letter to you, and yes, I know it will be a woman, because that's how these things work when the universe decides to intervene. Pay attention to her, not because I'm matchmaking from beyond the grave, but because the act of receiving this letter will have required trust from both of you. She'll have had to decide to honor the request of a stranger, and you'll have had to let someone into the sacred space of your grief." David looked up at Lily, who was studying her hands in her lap with intense concentration, clearly trying to give him privacy while being unable to avoid hearing Margaret's words. "I've included something else in this envelope, something I want you to give to her. Consider it a gift from me to the person brave enough to be the bridge between your past and your future." David reached for the smaller envelope, noting that it was sealed with wax, pressed with Margaret's grandmother's ring that she'd worn on her right hand. His name was written on it in the same careful script, but below it, in different ink as if added later, were the words, "For the woman who'll heal him." He looked at Lily again, this stranger who'd knocked on his door on Christmas Eve and handed him a letter from his dead wife. She wasn't beautiful in the way Margaret had been. Margaret had been all sharp angles and dramatic gestures, dark hair and darker eyes that could convey volumes with a single look. Lily was softer, rounder, with a face that suggested kindness and a quiet strength that came from having survived something difficult. "Margaret wrote something for you," David said, holding out the smaller envelope. "For me?" Lily's eyes widened, but she didn't know me. How could she? "She was always good at reading people," David said, "good at seeing patterns before they became obvious to everyone else." Lily took the envelope with careful hands, as if it might dissolve if handled roughly. "Should I open it now?" David nodded, curiosity overcoming the surreal nature of the situation. Lily broke the wax seal carefully, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and began to read silently. As she read, her expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something deeper and more complex. "What does it say?" David asked gently. She was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "She wrote about loss," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "About how grief changes you, but doesn't have to define you. She said that if I was reading this, it meant I was probably running from something painful, probably had moved to Minneapolis to start over, probably felt like I'd never be able to trust my instincts about people again." The accuracy of Margaret's observations hung in the air between them. David waited, sensing there was more. "She was right," Lily continued. "I moved here 6 months ago after my marriage ended. 20 years together, and I found out he'd been having an affair for the last 5. I came to Minneapolis because I needed to be somewhere that didn't have memories on every corner, somewhere I could figure out who I was without him." The parallel nature of their situations wasn't lost on either of them. Both refugees from different kinds of love, both trying to navigate the space between what was and what might be. "What else did she say?" David asked. Lily folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest as if it were something precious. "She said that healing happens in unexpected ways, usually when we're not looking for it. She said that sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need, disguised as something we weren't looking for. And she said that if I was brave enough to deliver her letter to you, I was probably brave enough to believe in new beginnings." They sat in the comfortable silence that follows profound revelations, each processing the magnitude of what Margaret had orchestrated. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything look possible again. "I don't understand how she could have known," David said finally. "How she could have predicted that you'd be the one to find the letter, that you'd be someone who understood loss." "Maybe she didn't predict it," Lily suggested. "Maybe she just trusted that the right person would find it when the time was right." David thought about the Margaret he'd known, her faith in the interconnectedness of things, her belief that love created ripples that extended far beyond what the eye could see. She'd always said that people found their way to each other when they needed to, that the universe had a way of correcting imbalances if you paid attention to the signs. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked, surprising himself with the normalcy of the offer. "I was just about to make some when you knocked." "I'd like that," Lily said, and something in her smile reminded him that it was Christmas Eve, that the world beyond his grief was still turning, still full of small kindnesses and unexpected connections. In the kitchen, David went through the motions he'd performed thousands of times, measuring coffee, filling the pot with water, listening to the familiar sounds of brewing. But tonight felt different, charged with possibility in a way he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Lily sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he and Margaret had eaten breakfast every morning of their marriage, but instead of feeling like an intrusion, her presence felt like a natural extension of the space. "Tell me about Eleanor," David said, as he set 2 mugs on the table. "How did you end up buying her house?" Lily wrapped her hands around the mug, using its warmth to chase away the last of the cold from her walk over. "The realtor said it had been on the market for almost a year," she said. "Eleanor's niece inherited it, but lived in California and just wanted it sold. It was priced below market value because it needed work, but I liked the bones of it. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, a kitchen window that looks out onto a garden that someone clearly loved." She paused, staring into her coffee, as if it held answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. "The first week after I moved in, neighbors kept stopping by with stories about Eleanor," she continued. "Apparently she was the person people went to when they needed someone to listen. She'd been a nurse before she retired, and she had this way of making people feel safe enough to tell her their secrets. The woman next door said Eleanor used to joke that she was the unofficial therapist for half of Minneapolis." "That sounds like someone Margaret would have sought out," David said. "She never liked traditional therapy, said she needed someone who understood that sometimes problems didn't have solutions, just needed to be witnessed." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, the kitchen warm with steam and the yellow light from the fixture Margaret had insisted on hanging, despite David's protests that it was too fancy for everyday use. He'd grown to love that light, the way it made everything look softer, more forgiving. "Can I ask you something?" Lily said eventually. "Of course." "What was she like, Margaret?" I feel like I know her a little from her letters, but I'd like to know more." David smiled for the first time in months, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "She was impossible," he said. "Stubborn and brilliant and completely incapable of giving up on anything she cared about. She collected strays, people, animals, causes that nobody else thought were worth fighting for. Our house was constantly full of friends who needed a place to stay, or co-workers going through divorces, or neighbors whose teenagers were giving them trouble." He paused, remembering the controlled chaos that had been their daily life, the way Margaret moved through the world like a force of nature disguised as an elementary school teacher. "She taught 4th grade," he continued, "and she always said those kids were her practice children before we had our own. We were going to start trying after she finished her master's degree, but then she got sick, and everything got put on hold while we focused on treatment." The shadow of that loss passed over his face, the future that had died with Margaret, the children they'd never had, the growing old together they'd been denied. "I'm sorry," Lily said softly. "That's a lot of loss to carry." "It is," David agreed. "But tonight, talking about her, it feels different. Like the memories are becoming something I can hold without being held by them, if that makes sense." "It does," Lily said. "After my divorce, I couldn't talk about the good years without feeling like I was betraying my anger about how it ended. But those 20 years still happened. They still mattered, even if they didn't lead where I thought they would." David refilled their coffee mugs, noting how natural it felt to have someone to talk to. Someone who understood the complicated mathematics of moving forward without leaving the past behind. "What brought you to teaching?" he asked, realizing he'd been monopolizing the conversation with his own story. Lily laughed, a sound that was warm and slightly self-deprecating. "Pure accident," she said. "I was an accounting major in college. Had this whole plan to work for a big firm and make lots of money. But I needed to take an elective, and the only thing that fit my schedule was Introduction to Early Childhood Development." She paused, smiling at the memory. The professor was this elderly woman who'd been teaching since the 60s, and she had this way of talking about children, as if they were individually wrapped gifts waiting to be opened. She said every child was a mystery worth solving, a puzzle with pieces that would reveal themselves if you paid attention. "I changed my major that semester and never looked back." "What age do you teach?" "2nd grade. 7- and 8-year-olds who still think teachers know everything and that the world operates on logic and fairness. It's heartbreaking and wonderful in equal measure." "Margaret would have liked you," David said, and was surprised by how certain he felt about that statement. "She always said she could tell everything she needed to know about a person by how they talked about children." They talked until the coffee grew cold and the snow outside accumulated into drifts that would make driving treacherous. David found himself telling stories he hadn't shared with anyone since Margaret's funeral. Funny memories, ridiculous arguments they'd had, the way she used to leave notes in his lunch bag even after 15 years of marriage. Lily shared her own stories with equal openness. The signs she'd ignored in her marriage, the way her ex-husband had gradually made her feel like she was too much and not enough simultaneously, the terror and exhilaration of starting over at 42 in a city where she knew no one. As the clock approached midnight, marking the transition from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day, both of them seemed to realize simultaneously that something significant was happening between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition, the acknowledgement that they were both people who'd been broken open by life and were slowly learning to trust again. "I should probably go," Lily said, though she made no move to stand. "The snow is getting pretty deep, and I don't want to get stuck here." "You could stay," David said, then immediately flushed red. "I mean on the couch. I have extra blankets, and the roads will be clearer in the morning. It's Christmas Eve, Christmas morning now. Nobody should have to drive in this weather." Lily considered his offer, And David held his breath, not realizing until that moment how much he wanted her to say yes, how much he didn't want to return to the silence of the house after she left. "If you're sure I wouldn't be imposing," she said finally. "You wouldn't be," David assured her. "Margaret always said Christmas morning was meant to be shared." David found himself in the unfamiliar territory of being a host again, retrieving blankets and pillows from the linen closet that still smelled like the lavender sachets Margaret had made every spring. He showed Lily where the bathroom was, gave her one of Margaret's old T-shirts to sleep in when she mentioned she hadn't planned on staying overnight anywhere. As he handed her the shirt, a soft cotton thing with a faded logo from a 5K they'd run together 6 years ago, he felt a moment of uncertainty. Was it wrong to give Margaret's clothes to another woman? Was this moving too fast, crossing boundaries he didn't even know he'd established? But when Lily took the shirt with gentle hands and said thank you without any of the awkwardness he'd expected, he realized that Margaret would have approved. She'd always believed that objects were meant to be used, not preserved as shrines to the past. "Good night, David," Lily said from the doorway of the living room, already looking smaller in Margaret's oversized shirt. "Thank you for letting me stay. Thank you for sharing her with me. Thank you for bringing her back to me," David replied, and meant it in more ways than he could articulate. In his bedroom, David lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else moving through his house. The soft footsteps in the hallway, the running water, the gentle settling of couch springs. For 3 years, the house had been a tomb, preserved exactly as Margaret had left it, silent except for his own movements and the mechanical sounds of heat and appliances. Tonight, it felt alive again. He thought about Margaret's letter, about her conviction that his happiness wouldn't diminish her memory, but honor it. The concept felt revolutionary after 3 years of believing that joy would be a betrayal. But Margaret had been right about most things during their marriage. Maybe she was right about this too. David woke on Christmas morning to the smell of coffee and something that might have been pancakes. For a moment, still caught between sleep and consciousness, he thought Margaret had come home, that the last 3 years had been an elaborate nightmare from which he was finally waking. Then he remembered Lily, remembered the letter, remembered the strange and wonderful Christmas Eve that had cracked something open inside his chest and let light in for the first time in 3 years. He found her in the kitchen, standing at the stove with her auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing Margaret's T-shirt and a pair of his sweatpants that she'd rolled up several times to accommodate the difference in their heights. She'd found the pancake mix he'd forgotten he had and was carefully flipping what looked like remarkably perfect circles onto a plate. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind that I made myself at home. I'm an early riser and I found the ingredients, and I thought you might be hungry." "I am," David realized with surprise. He couldn't remember the last time he'd woken up hungry rather than simply empty. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table as Christmas morning light streamed through the windows, turning the accumulated snow into a landscape of impossible brightness. David watched Lily cut her pancakes into precise triangles and eat them in order from smallest to largest, a quirk that reminded him that she was real, not a figment of his imagination or a ghost sent by Margaret to ease his loneliness. "What will you do today?" David asked as they finished eating. "Do you have family to visit?" Lily shook her head. "My parents died in a car accident 10 years ago, and I don't have any siblings. My ex-husband's family never particularly liked me, and since the divorce, I haven't heard from any of them. I was planning to spend the day reading and maybe taking a long bath, exciting Christmas plans for a 42-year-old woman." There was no self-pity in her tone, just the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who'd learned to be comfortable with solitude without necessarily enjoying it. "Would you like to spend it here instead?" David asked, surprising himself again with his willingness to extend the invitation. "I don't have any family left either, and I usually spend Christmas Day avoiding all the calls from well-meaning friends who think I shouldn't be alone. We could avoid them together." Lily smiled, the first truly uninhibited smile he'd seen from her. "I'd like that very much," she said. They spent Christmas Day the way David imagined normal people spent lazy Sundays, reading sections of the newspaper aloud to each other, talking about books they'd loved and movies they'd hated, discovering the small compatibilities and differences that form the foundation of friendship. Lily was funny in a quiet way, given to observations that caught him off guard and made him laugh despite himself. She was also remarkably easy to be with, comfortable with silence when conversation flagged, content to exist in the same space without feeling the need to fill every moment with words. In the afternoon, she convinced him to take a walk through the neighborhood to look at Christmas decorations, something he hadn't done since Margaret died. The snow had stopped falling, but lay thick on the ground, muffling sound and making the familiar streets look like scenes from a children's book. They walked slowly, their breath creating clouds in the cold air, and David found himself seeing the neighborhood through Lily's eyes. She noticed things he'd stopped paying attention to, the way the Johnsons had strung lights around every single tree in their yard, the elaborate nativity scene the Catholic family on the corner erected every year, the house where someone had built a snowman family complete with scarves and carrot noses. "It's beautiful here," Lily said, as they paused in front of the house with the purple shutters that she'd mentioned in her letter to Margaret. "I can see why you've stayed." "I never really chose to stay," David admitted. After Margaret died, leaving felt impossible, but so did actively deciding to remain. "I've been in suspended animation for 3 years, waiting for something to change, without doing anything to facilitate that change. And now?" Lily asked gently. "Now I'm beginning to think that waiting for readiness is a luxury I can't afford anymore," he said. Margaret was right. Grief was supposed to be a place I visited, not a place I lived. They walked back to David's house as the sun set, painting the snow pink and gold, and he realized that he'd made it through an entire Christmas Day without writing to Margaret, without performing the rituals of grief that had structured his holidays for 3 years. Instead of feeling guilty, he felt relieved, as if he'd been holding his breath for a very long time and could finally exhale. That evening, as Lily prepared to return to her own house, David found himself reluctant to let the day end. The house would return to its tomb-like silence, and he wasn't sure he could bear that after experiencing what it felt like to be alive again. "Could I walk you home?" he asked as she gathered her things, "just to make sure you get there safely." The walk to Lily's house took 15 minutes through snow-packed streets, their footsteps the only sound in the crystalline air. Her house was smaller than his, a craftsman bungalow with a front porch that suggested summer evenings and conversations with neighbors. Even in winter, covered in snow, it had a welcoming quality that spoke of someone who understood the importance of home. "Thank you," Lily said, as they stood on her front step. "For yesterday, for today, for letting me be part of something I didn't expect." "Thank you for knocking on my door," David replied, "for being brave enough to deliver a letter from a stranger to another stranger." They stood there for a moment, two people on the threshold of something neither quite understood yet, both aware that Christmas Eve had changed everything, but uncertain what came next. "Would you like to have coffee again sometime?" David asked, the words feeling foreign in his mouth after 3 years of avoiding social interaction. "I'd like that very much," Lily said. "Maybe we could try that new place on Grand Avenue. I've been wanting to check it out but haven't had the courage to go alone." "It's a date," David said, then immediately panicked at his choice of words. "I mean, not a date, just coffee, between friends, neighbors, people who—" Lily laughed, cutting off his flustered explanation. "I know what you meant," she said, "and yes, it's a date. A coffee date between two people who are figuring out what comes next. David walked home through the quiet streets, Margaret's letter folded carefully in his pocket, along with the envelope that had held Lily's letter. The houses around him glowed with warm light from within, and for the first time in 3 years he felt like he belonged in that light, rather than being forever outside of it. At home, he sat at his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, uncapped the fountain pen Margaret had given him, and began to write. But this time, the letter wasn't to Margaret. Dear Lily, thank you for the most unexpected Christmas of my life. Thank you for bringing me Margaret's final gift and for staying to help me unwrap it. Thank you for sharing pancakes and snowmen and the particular silence that comes with new friendship. I don't know what happens next between us, and I'm trying to be okay with that uncertainty. Margaret always said that the best things in life couldn't be planned, only recognized and embraced when they appeared. I think she would be pleased that her last act of love opened the door for me to learn to trust again. I'm looking forward to coffee with you, to learning more about the woman brave enough to deliver messages from the dead, to discovering what grows in the space between grief and hope. He signed his name and folded the letter carefully, then placed it in an envelope addressed to Lily Roberts. Tomorrow he would walk it over to her house on Elm Street, would knock on her door the way she'd knocked on his, would hand her words written in his own hand rather than the hand of someone speaking from beyond death. For the first time in 3 years, David Anderson went to sleep on Christmas night without the weight of unfinished grief pressing down on his chest. Instead, he felt the lighter, more complicated weight of possibility, of a future that might hold friendship and laughter, and eventually, perhaps, love that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. Outside, snow continued to fall on Minneapolis, covering the city in a blanket of white that made everything look possible again. And in 2 houses 6 blocks apart, 2 people who'd been running from different kinds of pain settled into sleep with the knowledge that sometimes the universe sends exactly what you need, disguised as something you weren't looking for. In the months that followed, David and Lily's coffee dates became a weekly tradition, then twice weekly, then a natural rhythm of shared meals and long walks and quiet evenings spent reading in each other's company. They moved slowly, both of them still tender from their respective losses, both learning to trust not just each other, but their own instincts about love and connection. Lily helped David sort through Margaret's belongings, not to erase her presence from the house, but to transform it from a shrine into a home where memories could coexist with new experiences. David helped Lily plant the garden she dreamed of in her backyard, kneeling beside her in the dirt as they put bulbs in the ground that wouldn't bloom until spring, an act of faith in future beauty. They talked about Margaret often, and David was amazed to discover that sharing her memory with someone who'd never known her didn't diminish her importance, but somehow expanded it. Through his stories, Lily came to understand the woman whose final act of love had brought them together, and through her questions and observations, David rediscovered aspects of his wife he'd forgotten in the fog of grief. By summer, they were spending most evenings together, and by fall, Lily had effectively moved into David's house. Though she kept her own place as a safety net, neither of them discussed, but both understood. The artificial Christmas tree that had stood in the corner for 4 years was finally taken down and replaced with a reading nook where they sat together in the evenings, Lily grading papers while David worked on the novel he'd started writing about a man who learns to live again after loss. On Christmas Eve of the 4th year after Margaret's death, David and Lily sat together at the kitchen table, addressing Christmas cards to the friends who'd watched David disappear into grief and then slowly return to the world. Among them was a card addressed to Eleanor Vance's niece in California, thanking her for preserving the letters Eleanor had kept and making it possible for David to receive Margaret's final gift exactly when he needed it most. As they worked, snow began to fall outside, and David felt the familiar tug of the anniversary, the pull toward the ritual of writing to Margaret that had sustained him through the darkest years of his grief. But this year, instead of retreating to his study alone, he found himself talking about Margaret with Lily, sharing new memories that surfaced when he wasn't actively excavating them for letters to the dead. "Do you miss the letters?" Lily asked as they sealed the last of the Christmas cards. The tradition of writing to her. "I thought I would," David admitted. "But I realized that I was writing those letters because I didn't know how to carry her with me in any other way. Now I talk to you about her, and it feels like she's part of our conversations rather than trapped in my study with my grief." He paused, considering how to articulate something he was only beginning to understand. "The letters were about trying to keep her alive," he continued. "But she was never really gone. She just changed form, became part of how I love instead of someone I loved." Lily reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture so natural it felt like something they'd been doing for decades rather than months. "I think she'd be proud of you," she said. "Of us. Of how we've learned to honor the past while building something new." That night, as they settled into sleep in the bed David had once shared with Margaret, he felt the completeness that comes not from the absence of loss, but from learning to integrate loss into a life that continues to unfold. Margaret was still with him, woven into the fabric of who he'd become, but she was no longer the only voice in the conversation about his future. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, and David woke to find Lily already in the kitchen, making pancakes the way she had that first morning, her hair caught in the same messy ponytail, her movements easy and familiar in the space they now shared. "Merry Christmas," she said when she saw him, and he crossed the kitchen to kiss her good morning, still marveling at the simple miracle of having someone to wake up beside, someone whose presence made the house feel like home rather than a museum. "Merry Christmas," he replied, and meant it in all the ways that mattered, as a celebration of the day, as gratitude for the unexpected gift of second chances, as recognition that love doesn't end when someone dies, but transforms, makes space for new love without diminishing what came before. They spent the day the way they'd learned to spend their days together, with books and conversation and the comfortable silence of two people who'd found their way back to trust. In the evening, as they sat together in the reading nook that had replaced Margaret's Christmas tree, David thought about the letter that had started everything, about Margaret's faith that love creates ripples extending far beyond what the eye can see. She'd been right, as she'd been right about so many things. Love hadn't ended with her death. It had changed form, become the foundation for the love he was learning to share with Lily, become the bridge between the man he'd been during his marriage and the man he was becoming in its aftermath. Outside, Minneapolis settled into another Christmas night, and in the house where David Anderson had once written letters to his dead wife, two people who'd been broken by different kinds of loss created new traditions, new memories, new ways of being in the world that honored what they'd been while embracing what they were becoming.